Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar about supporting K-12 students, how to support their learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are delighted to have some great panelists today who can answer your questions. So I'd like to introduce the director of the Hassenfeld Child Health Innovation Institute, Dr. Patrick Vivier. He is the director of the Institute. He is also a professor of health services, policy, and practice, and a professor of pediatrics, and a professor of emergency medicine. So Patrick, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to have our panelists. I'll first introduce Dr. Nancy Hill, who is the Charles Bigelow Professor of Education at Harvard University. She is a developmental psychologist whose research focuses on parenting and adolescent development. Specifically, Professor Hill's research focuses on the ways that race, socioeconomic status, and community context interact and impact youth's opportunities for upward mobility, especially through secondary school and post-secondary transitions. Her research also examines the relational supports and mechanisms associated with adolescents' emerging sense of purpose and views of the economy as they influence post-secondary transitions to college and career. Professor Hill is known for her work identifying developmentally sensitive strategies to maintain parental involvement in education during adolescence, particularly important during this time. She and her colleague, Alexis Redding, have a forthcoming book focused on the transition to adulthood and the historical precedents and rationale for extending the time to adulthood called The End of Adolescence, The Lost Art of Delaying Adulthood. Our other panelist is Dr. Nathaniel Schwartz, an associate professor of practice at the Annenberg Institute for the School Reform at Brown University. Dr. Schwartz has taken part in research on school improvement and professional training, professional learning, early post-secondary opportunities, and elementary literacy. He was previously the Chief Research and Strategy Officer for the Tennessee Department of Education. In that role, Professor Schwartz led the department's research and strategic planning teams, contributing to the launch of Tennessee Succeeds, a strategic plan and vision aimed at increasing post-secondary and career readiness for Tennessee's 1 million students. It also led to the creation of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, an innovative state-level research partnership with Vanderbilt University. And we're thrilled to have Professor Schwartz now here at Brown at the Annenberg Institute. And I know, Professor Schwartz, that you have been working on some research briefs that may be helpful to families. Do you want to start us off by talking about that a little bit?
Very quickly, the thing that leads me here today is, as I've been at Brown now for about a year, and as we started working with districts around Rhode Island, trying to ensure that Annenberg was having a positive impact on students' experiences in Rhode Island, the pandemic began, and we got into a whole conversation with district leaders about what it would mean for us to be most useful right now. And the thing that we heard repeatedly, which won't be surprising to any of you, was that school and district leaders were feeling so very reactive to everything that was going on, to figuring out school openings and closings, device access, meal access, protective equipment. And they felt like they were struggling to carve out the time and space for some of the really big questions about teaching and learning and school climate and family engagement, all the things that we know as parents, and I have a first and a fourth grader, feel like sort of the key things to get right now in school. And so what that has led to is an effort that we call Ed Research for Recovery, where we have been working with really spectacular researchers across the country, including Nancy Hill, to put together a series of short research briefs that try to summarize a decade's worth of research in a whole set of areas that school leaders were identifying as areas where they wanted better research guidance and didn't know where to turn. And so these are short briefs. The project, again, is called Ed Research for Recovery. And as we talk today, and I want to break into questions now, but as we talk today, I think a lot of at least what I rely on will be the synthesis work that researchers have been doing to try to take take what they know and bring it to the fore for pandemic times.
Amy has put that link up in the chat if people want to look at that now. And also want to remind folks that we do record these and we'll be able to post them. And once we do that to our website, we'll also put these links up on our website at the Hassenfeld Child Health Innovation Institute so that you can have these as resources going forward. And also want to remind everybody on the call that we really want your questions. We have some questions that have been set up already that we'll start with, but really encourage you to submit questions so that this is an interactive time and a chance for you to get input from these incredible experts. So why don't we get started? The first is the big question I'll ask both of you to answer. How can parents make sure everything is going okay under these incredibly stressful COVID situations while still managing their own work lives and not feeling either being overwhelmed or overbearing? How do you sort of do that balance given this very challenging time in the world? Would love to hear from each of you. I don't know, since Nate was just started, maybe Nancy, do you want to give the first crack at it?
Thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about these issues. I love thinking about families and kids and how do we love on them in special ways in this time. And to answer your question, I want to start with just having people think about what it means to be okay. You said, how do we check in and be okay? And I think in many ways, we have to let ourselves off the hook for thinking that in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of everything that we're experiencing in the United States around the election and racial strife and all the things that are going on in the world, what does it mean to be okay? And, is it okay that that we're feeling, stressed, or is it we shouldn't deny those feelings? And I think one of the first things to really think about in terms of supporting kids is to help them have language and space to talk about their feelings, to talk about, what it means to not be able to see their friends, and if they're going to school in these socially distanced ways, and to help them have language and safe space to talk about these things. I think that's part of what it means to be okay, is to give voice and acceptance to all the things that we're feeling as we go to bed at night knowing we didn't do well by much of anything. We didn't parent our kids the way we wanted to do. We didn't teach them third grade the way we should have. We didn't do our work. We didn't work as well or as hard or as much as we should have. So many times we feel like we end the day having not really dealt with our own responsibilities. And so I would encourage people to forgive themselves for not meeting their own standards and to be kind to themselves and to their families.
Great. It's important. Nate, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
I will add quickly two things that sprang to mind as Nancy was talking. The first is that it's a very strange thing being in an expert role on this when at so many times I think we in our family aren't entirely sure we're okay. Some days we are, some days we aren't. And I feel like that is a pretty useful universal experience right now. In terms of letting ourselves off the hook, I think the one thing that we did, I worked with a woman named Elaine Allensworth, who runs the Consortium for Chicago School Research. And the two of us together were trying to understand the research that had been done on learning loss and the various other events where kids had sort of encountered this kind of shock and disruption system. And it's hard because I think the media right now finds it very easy to sort of play up the idea of the long-term effects of this pandemic. And that might be the case, but there was a New York Times headline about the lost generation of COVID. And it is not clear to me that we are there yet. When you look at some of the past disruptions, when kids have been pushed out of schools for one reason or another, you can look at Hurricane Katrina, you can look at some of the school closures in Chicago. One of the things that you see is that most kids, many kids, end up back on the exact same trajectories they were on before this shock to the system. And the thing that is most predictive of that seems to be not so much the academic intervention they get, but actually the strength of the adult-student relationships in their lives. And so it feels like if there were one thing to concentrate on in your family, in your child's relationship with their school, it's actually how engaged the students remain versus the kinds of specific third grade content or standards they're receiving.
In terms of working with the school, how can parents advocate to ensure that their children are receiving the services that they need sort of in our current time? And then can also follow up, if there is loss during this, how do they advocate to make up for that going forward?
When I think about how to make up for the lost time, I want to agree with what Nate just said about the importance of the social aspects of this. And this is particularly true for adolescents, that those social connections are even more important than the academic connections. And being able to create opportunities for youth to engage with their friends, whether you're creating pods so that your kids, your teenage kids, can hang out with their friends is probably as important or more important than the academic content. And in terms of helping schools figure out how to support youth academically, I think part of the advocacy is about assessment, about figuring out where kids are and not letting them feel ashamed for what they might not have learned, or holding them accountable for learning things that were so much more difficult to learn in the context of Zoom. In the work that we're doing in a local high school where they're doing it's completely remote, and they do a lot asynchronously and they're doing a lot synchronously, and they've done what they can do in terms of handing out hotspots and Chromebooks and the like. But when we talk to those students about the impact of the pandemic, and particularly in one of the studies we're doing with the English language learners, one of the key things that they're missing is that they can't ask questions in the moment. That, how do they get to ask questions? And for many of the English language learners, they're losing the English language skills that they gained. And so how do we ask, not just hold schools accountable or ensure or insist, sounds like it's adversarial, rather than really partnering with schools to figure out how do we affirm students for what they were able to learn, assess where they are, and then provide tutoring and support and more individualized instructions, which classroom teachers can't do on their own. But how do we support those classroom teachers and support families in doing those assessments so we can meet students where they are and then provide them the kind of instruction that they need to move from where they are to where they should be?
Nate, do you want to add to that? Thoughts of what families should be doing in terms of advocating around schools and things?
I think it really depends on what on the specifics of your student. And Nancy, you mentioned EL students, English learners. I think another category of students where we know they will need more individualized support and it's hard to provide in a virtual environment are students with disabilities. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a little bit is how can we ensure that students with disabilities actually are receiving individual or small group time with interventionists, even through the virtual space. And so I think that reminding schools that the small group time for any students, but particularly for some of the more vulnerable groups, are really important right now. Feels like something that needs to happen, and many schools and districts are getting this right, but it's a hard thing to do right now. And so if I were to push for one thing, it would be that during that synchronous time, if you're in a virtual school, during that synchronous time, which is necessarily short, the students are spending as much of that as possible in smaller groups versus in these sort of large 20, 25, 30 person lessons, because the thing we know is kids can only spend so much time on Zoom like the rest of us. And given that, using that time on Zoom in a way where they're receiving individualized feedback from an interventionist, from a tutor, or from their teacher, rather than using it to make it look like normal school, feels really important.
Now, you mentioned synchronous and asynchronous. Can you both talk a little bit about that? Do we know enough about remote learning to understand the differences between synchronous and asynchronous? And how does that differ by grade levels? Can you talk about that a little bit? Either of you would like to start?
Two things. And so I know in Rhode Island, many schools have started in person, although the interesting trend that we've seen has been that even for, with many schools and districts open in person, a number of parents and students, for good reasons, have chosen to opt out, maybe because they have a particular vulnerability at home, or and so given that, what we're still seeing is we are still seeing the need for distance learning, even in a space where some kids are going to school. And I think looking at the research on distance learning, we know a couple things. We know that generally it does seem less effective in terms of raising academic scores, for example, than in-person learning. But I think that is something that for relatively short times, we all can get through. And then I think the other issue is that the places we've seen the biggest problems have been when schools have tried to make distance learning feel like the exact same experience that students are having or would have if they weren't in a virtual environment. And so the push that we're making as a research team is for schools to kind of reimagine their pedagogy, and there are good models out there, flipped learning classrooms, where the asynchronous time is spent in delivering sort of expository content, and then the action, the interactive portion, happens in small groups in synchronous time. And that requires, that demands a lot of teachers. And so we here at my house are feeling very, very grateful for all the work that teachers are trying to do during this time, even knowing that, and I have some of them in my family, it's feeling imperfect to them too.
Nancy, what would you like to add?
Oh, I would just agree with everything that Nate said, that when we moved online in the emergency way back in March, that there wasn't time for, or space or professional development for teachers to think about how to deliver their planned content in an online space. And so for many people, the easiest thing to do was to do what they had already been doing, which is to try to recreate the classroom. But the giving students the kind of more individualized attention in the synchronous space is one of the key ways in which youth learn, and having the recorded asynchronous delivery of the information means that kids can, particularly older kids, can go back and re-listen to how the lesson was delivered as they apply it in their own homework or in the asynchronous or in the synchronous platform. I just think it all works less well the younger you get. And that it's really hard for young children to learn in a Zoom context. And it's also hard for parents to direct that learning as substitute teachers, as it were, or stand-in teachers.
So a question that was just submitted that I think is related to this is it reasonable that a parent in Rhode Island who opted out of in-person school, that their child received the same amount in quality of instruction? What can be expected in a school system where, as Nate was saying earlier, some, for very good reasons, some family need to keep their children out? What are the ways to make sure if you're a remote student in a school that's in person, what's a reasonable expectation and how do you maximize that experience? Nancy, do you want to start with that?
No, I'm going to let Nate take that first.
Nate take that one first? Okay, good.
No, I was just going to punt. I was going to say it's a really good question. And I think this in particular feels like one that our system has just never had to deal with. And I don't think anyone knows the answer. I guess, so one of the things that we've been trying to do recently is even look at the numbers of who's opting in and who's opting out of virtual versus in-person school. And I would say in most of the districts across the country that we've seen return in person, we're still seeing 30 to 40% of kids staying home, which is a large, large number. And often those are the kids who often, at least in some places where I'm getting data, those are the kids who are more likely to be lower income, potentially more likely to need more individualized attention. And it is hard that they aren't getting it. And I don't think there's an easy answer, except that in the larger school systems, the ones that are managing to separate out a virtual academy from the sort of in-person classroom seem to be mildly more successful than the places that require a teacher to do both at once, which just feels nearly impossible.
Yeah, I, as the question was centered around what should parents expect, if there are good reasons why parents need to have their children engage remotely, and we need to honor where they are and the decisions that they're making. And Nate described, many of those who are choosing remote might be low income, but there are also a large portion of wealthier families who are choosing remote and are hiring instructors to deliver the curriculum. And so I think there's a wide demographic variation in the people who are choosing this. And I still think that the school is obligated to educate all children. Now, does it mean that that one single classroom teacher has to educate everyone in all the different modalities? But I think in this context that we really need to be investing in diverse modalities of instruction. And even when you think about the homeschooling more generally, even before the pandemic, that parents who opted to homeschool still had to have their curriculum approved by and permission approved by the school districts in which those kids were to enroll as part of compulsory education. And so I think there is a responsibility for districts to provide instruction. But then the question becomes, how do we support districts and teachers and schools in providing education via these diverse modalities?
Related to this, we're talking a lot about the sort of virtual and the impact of virtual. Can either of you talk about the impact for those who are going back to school but wearing masks and distance? And do we have any sense, either from the experience in the spring or now, or other examples of what should be expected even for those where this push to get back in school, of what are the expectations for this academic year and sort of progress to?
I think it's hard on teachers and it's hard on kids, but I think most people want to be back in school if they can figure out and trust that it's a safe option. I think part of the challenge is figuring out what it means to help teachers and students and families feel that they are safe in going back to school. I know in Boston, they, up to this point, they've had those with disabilities in the building, and other students are remote, but they just decided that this week that everyone's going to go remote because of the incidence rates have increased. And in many of the buildings are older buildings, they can't open windows, they don't have good ventilation. And so I think part of it is figuring out what are the ways in which we can help families and students and teachers feel safe in the building. And I think if we can achieve that, then most people want to be back in school.
Another quick Rhode Island data point. We're starting to run a series of workshops where Rhode Island district teams are coming together to think about their recovery efforts and learn from each other. And the first of these, the kickoff session, we asked a bunch of Rhode Island superintendents about their starting weeks of school and what things had surprised them the most, or what things they were both learning and feeling challenged by as they were returning. And two things stood out there. The first was that they were saying that several people said that the logistics of going back to school, the masks, the kids moving single file in the right places, the sort of exits and entrances, and all of that, which had been kind of an all-consuming discussion for the central office for the months of the summer, had actually been much smoother than anyone expected. And I can add my own data point, again, as the parent of a first and fourth grader, that we send our kids off to school each day with their masks, and that part hasn't been that bad. I mean, they adapt quickly to that, and we've appreciated that. And they seem to adapt much faster than all the parents and teachers who are still struggling to remember their masks. The other thing that felt surprising to people, or not surprising, but the other thing that was a topic of discussion was the level of burnout that school staff members were feeling at this point. And all school staff members, right? Teachers were feeling it for one reason, principals were feeling it for another reason, superintendents were feeling it for another reason. And I think it is a really hard time to be a school administrator, knowing that you would like to be doing something differently, and there are so many constraints on what you're doing. And so, again, alongside Nancy's call for giving grace to ourselves, I think it is requiring sort of a kind of understanding of the challenges being faced in schools right now.
So a question that just came in is not specific to in school, but is about tutoring. And the person asking the question is one of the leaders of a program here at Brown University called Bright, where it connects Brown University students with refugee youth in Providence for one-on-one tutoring. And it's a big program, 192 students involved in the program. That's usually an in-person model, but obviously during the pandemic, they've had to go virtual. And the question is, what are some of the best practices for engaging with students virtually who've experienced significant learning loss during the last few months of the school year, as well as the summer months? Aside from issues of lack of devices, internet connection, it's been difficult to sustain motivation for students that have been able to connect with their tutors. So beyond the classroom, something like this with tutoring, where not only the last few months, but these might be students who face other adversities and that need to be addressed. What are your suggestions for such tutoring programs and how to maximize that once they have to go virtual?
I think still the relationship piece is so important, and building that and maintaining that relationship between the tutor and the student and all the possible ways that it can be done. I think focusing on that connection, even as much as the content, but trying to think of all the different ways in which the tutor can make a connection, can connect virtually. They can go together someplace, in places on the internet. Can they get together in a socially distant way in the community where they can see each other, but in a socially distant way? The relationship and the sustaining of that relationship is so important. And as we think about into the future, more individualized learning that's going to be required to overcome learning losses in this time, it's in these programs like this one where you can provide, it's a mechanism for providing this kind of individualized instruction. And I think at this point, I would focus as much on the relationship, the social connection, as on the content.
I so much agree. I think that services like the one you're providing feel like these services that will get us through this moment. And the struggles that I imagine you're having sustaining motivation are struggles that school personnel across the country are having. I put up a blog post by our own Matt Kraft at the Annenberg Institute. And he and Susanna Loeb are both working actually right now to pull together some lessons about both online and in-person tutoring to create another research synthesis that will eventually go onto this Ed Research for Recovery site. So we hope to have an even sort of better summary of this. But my takeaway right now from what Matt Kraft has written is that the extent to which a tutoring program is actually integrated into the school day, or not into the school day in terms of the schedule, but also into the school day in terms of being closely aligned with the work that the teacher is doing, feels incredibly important. So under No Child Left Behind, there were a bunch of sort of supplementary tutoring programs that were paid for by the federal government that didn't seem incredibly strong. And then there have been programs like the one that Matt is writing about at the Match schools in Boston, where those programs actually looked much more like a sort of part of the child's day, where the child would go to this, this class, the tutor would work directly with their teacher, and it would be a sustained relationship, like Nancy's talking about, over a year or more period, where these two would get to know each other and feel like, rather than it being kind of a drop-in service, it was actually something that built a relationship over a long period. And I think all of those things are important. I don't think that it solves the sort of issues of how do you keep people engaged virtually, but to the extent that you can draw on all of those, the resources of the child's teacher, the resources of a long-term relationship, and the resources of feeling like this is part of what the student does versus an extra supplement, I think you're on the right track.
Moving, and we touched on this a little bit, but in terms of students with special needs, are there specific things that folks should be thinking about in this environment for learners with special needs?
This is not my area of expertise. So the information that I have comes from a different research brief that is on that same site that Amy put up onto the chat box, written by some really great researchers, Nate Jones at Boston University, Lynn Fuchs at Vanderbilt, and Sharon Vaughn at the University of Texas. And they offer, I think, some useful advice and some good examples of places that seem to be doing this well. One of my takeaways from reading their brief has been that it is not sufficient to expect that students with special needs can get everything they need, even in a well-differentiated traditional class. The reason we have individualized education plans, the reason we have interventionists, is because those additions really make a tremendous difference and can be tailored to the student's need in a way that you, even the best sort of differentiation in a mainstream classroom cannot do. And so one of the things they say during this time when everyone's time is limited, ensuring that the child has the right access to interventionists in the school feels really crucial. And I know that there are some schools that I've heard about in various places, including Rhode Island, that for a period of time in the spring suspended IEP evaluations and stopped sort of providing exactly providing the evaluative services that allowed students to then build new IEPs and have the additional services they need, because it just felt sort of unmanageable. And I think while that might have made sense at one point, given what we know about the length of time that we're all spending in pandemic conditions, it no longer makes sense. And it is incredibly important that schools find a way to continue to evaluate, continue to write IEPs, and continue to provide intervention services. And if that is not happening, that is an area where both the school is not following the federal law, and that is an area where parent advocacy can really matter.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Nate said. And what I would add is, as we think about students' needs, Nate talked about the academic needs and special needs, but we also need to think about the mental health resources that families and students receive in schools, and that for a short period of time, whether it's from March to the end of the school year, to not have access to mental and behavioral health services that are received through school, it's just not acceptable for the long term, that we as districts need to figure out how to connect families to resources either through the schools or through the community, through state or local mental health services, so that they can continue to receive those services into the school year.
It's been brought up a lot in terms of the social aspects of this experience. Starting with you, Nancy, what can families do to continue to support the social development? Whether that's for remote learners or for students going back to school where the social interaction is still quite regulated. Not just supporting social needs for the academic, but in terms of social development of the kids. What's your advice for families?
My advice to families is to remember that across this age span, but for somewhat different reasons, these social connections and social relationships are so important to students' learning and their emotion regulation, their self-regulation, their ability to learn to connect to one another. It's so important. And it's important for parents too, to have these social connections. And as we think into the long term, my recommendation is to consider how safely families can create social interactions around pods, thinking about who will be in your pod, so that your child has friends that they can play with. And doing that in a way that's safe medically, whether you decide that, okay, everybody quarantines for 2 weeks and then we get a weekend together, or we're going to agree upon rules around contact, so that kids and families have real social connections. That there are kids that I know who have not been hugged outside of their parents, who have not nestled up with their friends in months and months. And again, when it was just going to be a couple of months, or it was just the end of the school year, that might have been okay. But now that we are progressing on into potentially a full academic school year, where kids are not able to be together in the ways that they often have, we have to really think about what are the ways in which we can safely create pods, so that kids can have the kind of normal physical touch, social interactions, where they can feel comfortable engaging with their friends. Those friendships and social connections are so important, especially in adolescence. We think about it with little kids as they roll around on the floor together and use more touch than words. But those physical connections and social connections are even more important in adolescence. And we often will think about adolescence in the stereotypical ways, like, oh yeah, well, they're both all sitting there texting each other, they should just do that. But it is that being in the physical presence is not only good in terms of their social interactions, but it has neurochemical reactions as well in terms of their brain development and neural development, to have those kinds of social connections and intimate connections that adolescents really need.
I mostly just agree. And I agree not from knowing the research in this area so much as watching my kids and feeling like the worst time for us was the end of the summer, when my wife and I were both working, and it felt like our kids had nothing else to do, no one else to play with. And for a little while that had seemed novel and kind of interesting, and it no longer seemed novel and interesting by the end of the summer. And the things that started to make a difference were, first of all, the social interactions, even virtually, mattered. And so what I mean by that is, our son, for a while, we'd had all these rules about him on iPads and things, and then he started to play more Minecraft with his friends on iPad, and Roblox, and whatever else it was that he was playing. He's fairly young. And I think I initially shied away from that as the answer to our problems and was sort of impressed by how happy it made him and how happy it made our friends. Just again, his friends to have these interactions that weren't the same as the types of interactions we'd had previously, but felt like they were something different and something meaningful. And then the return to virtual school helped, and then the return to non-virtual school really helped. And I guess that my takeaway from that is that there was a period of this pandemic when our family didn't fully recognize just how starved we were for those social connections with people other than ourselves. And as we've moved back toward that, number one, it would be very hard to move away again. And that is a sort of concerning piece about the winter.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, it seemed to make a tremendous difference to our kids' emotional lives and therefore to everything about the ways they interacted with the world.
I think that brings us to the, a reminder that we're not just talking about the nuts and bolts of virtual learning or synchronous or asynchronous, but really acknowledging what an incredibly traumatic time this is in the world. We've been mainly focused on COVID, but don't want to miss, the recognizing the role of racism in our society as a public health crisis and facing those of the stress that can bring, as well as the other divisions and issues that are happening in the world. Can you talk a little bit about how do parents help their children through this time that can only be described as traumatic in the world? What can parents do? What can they expect from schools? And I recognize it's a big question, given this might be quite different for a first grader versus a senior. So give you each some time to sort of, again, just recognize the trauma of these days and how do we support our children?
How we begin to support our children is to start with supporting ourselves and to think about and acknowledge the stress that we are feeling as parents, as adults, as workers, and acknowledge that stress and name it, and then put in place aspects and times in the day and the week that we engage in self-care, whatever that looks like, whether it's meditation or yoga or spiritual beliefs or faith communities, but to really acknowledge the balance of life that's required to navigate this, that we have to focus on our own mental health first, and then we can focus on really providing space for kids to be kids, that protecting kids from the media. And it's hard because they're on Zoom, they're on the internet, but how do we protect them, particularly the young ones and the young teenagers? I always like to think of young kids and young teenagers as needing somewhat similar kinds of protections because they're vulnerable in particular ways. But how do we protect them from what we see, what they might see in the media, and to talk about what it means, and like when they are exposed to in the media and in the news, to really talk about what's our sense of agency, what do we believe as a family, where do we stand, that the world has many, many messages, some of which we agree with, some of which we disagree with, and we might not even agree amongst ourselves in our family, but we're going to have a conversation about it. How do we talk about tolerance in a different way now? And when I think about, we've always, as a person of color, we always talk about, racial tolerance in my family. But when we talk about, well, what does that look like now when we're not even supposed to be within 6 feet of each other? and how do we think about those ways in which wearing masks and socially distance can create this sense that we should be afraid of others? And one of my colleagues, who's a physician, is beginning to see stranger danger in infants at earlier ages than prior to the pandemic, because people are so concerned about exposure to other people. So how do we really talk about those issues and create space for kids to talk about their feelings and talk about it. One of the strategies that I heard that I picked up and we use in my family is that it's called lost and found, and we have the lost jar and the found jar. And the lost jar, we put in that lost jar all the things that we've lost. Like we were supposed to take this vacation and we weren't able to take it. We've lost the opportunity to hang out with our friends the way we used to. We've lost the opportunity to go to the theater or to the restaurants that we like. But what can we put in the found jar? And in the found jar in our family, we put in that jar that, whereas my son, I have a son in third grade and then an older daughter in college, he's going to school socially distant, and that's a found compared to March, by the way. The loss is that they don't have the reading nook, but the found is he's getting to go to school. The found is that, we're spending a lot more family time together, that we don't miss game nights because we aren't traveling as much anymore. There's no commute times, and we live in Boston where commute times are long. And so how do we think about the found jar and then rightfully grieve the lost jar? Let's not pretend those aren't losses and name them, and so that we can feel them. Even if they're small, they're significant. But to also orient ourselves, well, what are we gaining? And even if there's small things that we're gaining, what are we gaining? And to account for those, but to really give intentional space for self-reflection and mental health for the parents, and then for the children.
Just thinking about how much of what Nancy said involves kind of explicitly talking about things that we might be tempted to ignore. And so on the trauma front, that means understanding that it is a traumatic world, particularly now, and that engaging kids around their trauma is much more likely to make a positive difference than sweeping it under the rug. And I think there are a bunch of studies out there of various sort of mindfulness programs or post-traumatic programs that reduce post-traumatic stress and actually make a significant difference to the ways that kids move past a traumatic experience. I think also, and again, this is venturing outside my area of expertise, but my understanding, and Nancy, you should confirm whether this is right, is that the research actually suggests that trying to bring kids up to imagine sort of a colorblind world is not at all the way to go. And that if we want to move past the sort of the racist world that we live in, the way to do that involves really explicitly talking about the issues, really explicitly talking about race as something that children will encounter again and again, no matter their own race or ethnicity, and allowing them to think about how do you take that head on versus thinking that it's something that you can avoid.
We'll add to that, Nate, and agree that you can't deal with this in terms of trying to raise kids to be colorblind, because the systems in place are not colorblind. The systems in place marginalize on race and socioeconomic status. And I think we can talk about race and tolerance around valuing people who are different, and leaning into difference and affirming identity as a very basic and baseline set of strategies. But where we really get to the meat of the matter is when we talk about power and privilege, and what it means to have power and privilege. And how do we use, if everyone has power and privilege, but varying amounts of it, how do we use that power and privilege for good? And in having power and privilege doesn't mean that those who are privileged don't have setbacks, or, aren't somehow, got a free ride all the way. Of course they had setbacks, and of course they've worked hard. Of course they've had effort. but they've had a tailwind that has blown them farther than their efforts should have taken them. And on the converse, you have other people who have worked just as hard, but instead of tailwinds, they have headwinds. And those headwinds mean that they aren't going to get as far for their effort and talent than someone who has a tailwind. But it doesn't mean that there are people who don't have setbacks or people who don't have power and privilege. But how do we talk about those systems that give power and privilege in inequitable ways? And then you're creating this sense of target for agency and civic engagement and social justice that then creates a sense of empowerment. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about today that's so important for teens in this season is that they need to feel a sense of purpose in this. They need to feel a sense of agency in this. Whether it's agency around their schoolwork, and we could say teachers should do more, and sure they should be supported more, and school districts should do more, and sure they should do more, and we should support them in doing this. But how do we help students take responsibility for their own schoolwork? I mean, for the first time, like they don't have to go to school at 7:30 in the morning because it's asynchronous. Okay, great. That's in the found jar. Now that means that how do we help those students then take agency for how they're going to get their work done? For how do they make a difference? And so then you can create the sense of agency and civic engagement in ways that we might not have been able to do so before. But that's part of the racial justice piece, is really thinking about power and privilege and how it's distributed and the ways in which the systems perpetuate it as targets for social justice and civic engagement.
So when Nancy was working on the brief that she added to the Ed Research for Recovery series, one of the things that came out in this brief that was about the ways that schools could call on parents for support with their students. And one of the things I think you said, and you said this applies especially to adolescents, but probably at all ages, is that the best kind of parent help is not parent help around school content, but is actually parent help around work habits and sort of supporting kids in developing systems of their own that then allow them that sense of purpose that you're describing, where they own the work and are not being pushed to do it by a parent or a tutor or anything like that. Can you talk more about what that actually looks like in practice for those of us who want to develop that in our own kids?
Yeah, and that's particularly true in adolescence, but also in elementary school. The research on parent help with homework is fraught. That, some research says, parental help with homework, it's the best thing, and it's associated with higher achievement. But a lot of it suggests that it's, very conflictual, that when they're trying to help on content, it often results in conflict. It often results in disengagement. And parents don't necessarily know the pedagogy that the teacher's doing. We joke in my household, because I have an older daughter and a third grader, that every generation they change the math curriculum so parents can't help. So suddenly I'm teaching my second grader and third grader, and we don't carry the one anymore. So, so what gives? We're carrying the one in my household. Suddenly he's like, no, we're not, Mom. And so you get these battles, but part of what it looks like is having the adolescent plan their day, that you've got to get all these things done. And yes, you should be able to do some Minecraft and hang out and text your friends or whatever, but you have to get the work done. So how do you develop a plan and give them some agency to set the plan? Parents help with creating the structure, even creating the meaning and the purpose, connecting the schoolwork to what they're interested in or to their future. Those are all good roles for parents. But actually helping them with the mechanics of homework, parents are better off, and youth are too, really encouraging the youth to advocate for themselves, to reach out to the parents, to the teachers themselves, and create that sense of ownership and agency is the best thing that parents can do, rather than trying to help them with the content of the work.
I think we'll make that the last word, unless there's anything anything that you must say. I must say thank you so much to both of our panelists. I think this has been an incredible conversation that I've really enjoyed for this past hour, and I'm sure has been very helpful for our participants. So we really appreciate you taking that time with us. We will, as I said, post this along with the links that were shared. We'll make sure that gets up. But thank you both so much. It's just incredible hour, and also thank you, Amy, for setting all of this up, and our technical people as well. So, and thank you to the participants for being with us. So, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and to Patrick and to the participants as well.